What does it mean when churches get in conflict? What does it mean for us as leaders to try to understand church conflict? Church conflict is an expression in words and actions of disharmony between different opinions and desires in all human systems. Families have conflict. Businesses have conflict. Communities have conflict. Couples have conflict. And churches have conflict. It may be the kind of conflict that is very overt and results in fights that are open and that sometimes even violent, or they may be covert, manifested in very disguised sorts of ways. Most often, church conflict, whatever presents itself on the surface, is not necessarily everything that's going on. Often petty quarrels are a mask for deeper conflicts that exist beneath the surface. In our class, we want to approach the topic of church conflict, in particular by using family systems theory as a way to understand it. Because all of us are part of family systems in a variety of ways and have been so since our earliest days, all of us understand ourselves in some sort of familial relationships. In many ways in church conflict, leaders and followers are like parents and children, and they act that way. The difficulty lies, of course, is that all of us bring what we know to the conflict. People replicate the patterns that they've learned at home. They learn how to fight or flight. They learn to be passive-aggressive, or they learn to be aggressive-aggressive, or they learn to be passive-passive, or any number of other ways. Denial, other techniques, expressing their anger, many ways that people find to engage in conflict with others. The local congregation is like a great big family. It's like a large family system. It often has other families, smaller family system groups, and then often it just has individuals who operate independently. The thing to remember is that conflict is normal. Emotions that go with it are normal. Anger and frustration and denial are a part of who we are as human beings. This is not to be avoided. It's to be understood. When we talk about boundaries, we want to use the term the way that Cosgrove and Hatfield use this term in their book, Church Conflict, the hidden systems behind the fights. And so we want to talk about boundaries not so much as how you protect yourselves or the way that you protect yourself from someone else, but boundaries as styles of interaction. In other words, how we interact with other people. What is it like when it goes from us to them or from them to us? From us to another group, or from a group to us, or from our group to another group. The styles of interaction. Though the key to understanding power dynamics is to understand how boundaries work. What is the nature of a boundary? And how does it function when we try to figure out who's in charge and who's not? There's two aspects of boundaries that we want to try to understand the vocabulary about. And that is structure and quality. Structure and quality. Structure explains the implicit relations of leadership and deferral in the system. Structure of a boundary is about who's in charge, so to speak, or who has the power in one way or another. Some of that's very explicit, sometimes it's not. Some of that power is built into the system intentionally, sometimes it's not. When we talk about quality, we're talking about the patterns of communication along that boundary. Not just the structure of who's where, but also how that communication is functioning at a given moment in time. So let's talk about structure for a minute. Structure refers to the division that establishes parents and children in a system. Who leads, who follows, who has the power, who gets deferred to, and who offers the deference. Structure also describes the divisions of family into subsystems. For example, if you have one group that's responsible to another group, a subset to another group. Let me give you an example of that, perhaps. You have a board of trustees that is responsible for buildings and grounds and insurance and deeds and everything that has to do with real property. they may create a subgroup that specifically deals with a manse or a parsonage. That group, therefore, would have a boundary where they would be the child and the trustees would be the parent between two groups. Subsystems are fundamental units of power within congregations, and they have their roles in different ways. Now, when we talk about the quality of boundaries, quality refers to the degree and clarity of communication across the boundary. In other words, how's it going? How's the communication working? Boundaries can be rigid, meaning there's no communication happening. They can be porous, which means there's a lot of good communication flowing back and forth. Or they can be diffuse, which means there's a little of this, there's a little of that. Rigid boundaries are closed. They admit little or no communication. They inhibit any mutual understanding across the boundary. Porous admits communication, offers clarity, makes it possible for people to share information. Diffuse characterizes unclear communication, over-involvement, or enmeshment in some way, where the quality of the communication, even though there is some communication, is less than what's desired. Now, think about this for a minute. Let's back up. When we talk about structure, we're talking about who's the parent, who's the child. If you have two individuals, say for example, a senior pastor and a church member, more often than not, the pastor, the lead pastor, is the one who has the power, and the average church member, less power. And so the senior pastor or the lead pastor would be the person who is the parent, where the individual church member is not, is the child in some way. If they have a good porous communication between them, it doesn't mean that one lords it over the other just because there's deferral in the system. But if they have a closed communication by either side, they're not going to communicate. It doesn't change who's the parent and who's the child. Sometimes the boundaries can be mixed. They can be hybrid, especially when persons with different communication styles interact within a system. One thinks they're being open, but the other person is not hearing them clearly, or vice versa. Mixed boundaries do not admit clear and open communication. It makes it a struggle. Boundaries can be disputed when one party rejects the role given by another. A new pastor is appointed, and the person who is supposed to offer deference to that person says, I'm not going to play. I'm going to take my ball and go home. I'm not going to be a part of this. And so the boundary, even though the one side is trying to be open in the boundary, the other person is disputing that and therefore not going to give you good quality boundary. Sometimes rigid or diffused or enmeshed boundaries, mixed or disputed boundaries, those are the things that will make it hard to get past conflict, will exacerbate problems and situations and conflictive and disputed situations. And because of that, it makes it very difficult for conflict to be creatively worked through. Therefore, this is the first time I'll say this, therefore, one of the tasks of leadership is to help there be good communication, good quality across boundary lines. When you talk about parent and child roles, we usually talk about 4 different styles of parenting. Paternalism, I should say here, put your finger in the text and step into the margin. We're not talking about gender roles when we use the words paternalism and maternalism. We're just using them as terminology. A woman can be paternalistic and a man can be maternalistic very easily. Paternalism is domination without nurture. It's authority that takes away responsibility. I'm the parent, I'm going to tell you what's good for you. This is what you should do. Autonomism is domination without care. I'm going to tell you what you should do, but I really don't care what you do. It's psychologically detached, if you will. Maternalism is caregiving through enmeshment. It's creating that emotional dependence. I'm going to tell you what you should do because I know well what you should do, and don't you think that's a good idea? And let's do this together, but really I'm telling you what to do. Paternalism and autonomism and maternalism are all difficult concepts. They're easy to understand. They're difficult to operate across lines of communication or boundaries. Nurturance, the preferred way, is nurture that helps others grow. I'm going to help you. I'm not going to dominate you. I'm not going to make you dependent on me. Paternalism, maternalism. And I'm not going to ignore you. Autonomism. But I'm going to teach you and help you to discover your own creativity, your own ability to solve your own problems and conflicts, so that you can be an independent adult eventually and not be in a parent-child relationship. So what about people who are a problem in the system and they don't ever want to listen to what you're trying to do? There are people in a system who, for whatever reason, the system tolerates them. Their unacceptable behavior is a systems issue because the system is going to let them do that. They may be the scapegoat for the system. They may be the one who gets blamed for everything. But for some reason, they never are asked to change, or they're never involved in changing. Often that a person who is the offending one is symptomatic of the whole group's problem, but they allow it to go on because they can force it on one person. The problem person is tolerated for several reasons, usually to avoid change or challenge, or to protect rules and values that are unwritten. Problem people can serve a valuable function. They help the system stay the way it is and not change. So when you try to map a family system, you try to understand what's going on, here are some key helps. First, what's going on? Who said what? Are there any nonverbal actions? What's really happening here? Explain the narrative. Who are the players? Who are the principals in the conflict? Are the principal groups, subsystems, affiliations and coalitions? Two groups ganging up against one, two people ganging up against another. Who are the ghosts? People who are present but are not really present, but their memory is strong enough and their influence is strong enough that it lasts beyond their physical presence. What are the memories that are involved? And of course, what's your role in the conflict? What do the boundaries tell you? When you try to map it out and say, here's the groups and here's what's going on, what are these boundaries telling you? Well, if this one's a disputed boundary and this one's a blocked or closed boundary, a rigid boundary, and this one over here is diffuse, there's only one place in the system where there's really good communication going on. No wonder there's conflict. Nobody is able to talk to each other, except in one instance. So when you start looking at the boundaries, you try to figure out what's really happening. And then you listen for rules in language. What's being said that says, well, it has to be this way or it has to be that way? What happens if somebody breaks the rule? What are the language patterns? How are people explaining it? And then the last thing you do is you do a completeness test. You say, do I think I have the big picture here? How do all the systems part relate to each other? And then the final thing you do is you check your own feelings and say, what's my role in all this? And how have I been involved? When you talk about conflictive situations in church, the thing to remember is it's not about you. It's about them. It's about the situation. It's about family histories and patterns of interaction. It's about boundaries, structure and quality of boundaries, parental roles, child roles, independent children, quarreling siblings. All the things that happen in families happen in church conflict. I look forward to talking to you more about this on Thursday.